My stepson locked me out of my own house. I said nothing. The next morning I handed him an envelope. He laughed, "Finally, you get it," until he opened it, and his face went pale. But that wasn't the beginning. The beginning was the sound of my own key turning in a lock that no longer belonged to me. It was just after 10 that night. The porch light was on, glowing the same warm yellow it had for 30 years. I remember thinking how steady it looked, like nothing in the world had shifted. I'd gone to dinner with two old friends from my teaching days. We talked about retirement plans, cholesterol numbers, and how fast grandchildren grow. Ordinary things. Safe things. I wasn't prepared for the way the key stopped halfway. I tried again slower. The metal scraped uselessly against something unfamiliar inside the mechanism. That's when I noticed the scratch marks near the deadbolt, fresh bright against the dark paint. The lock had been changed. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe a repair. Maybe my wife Linda had called a locksmith after the old one jammed last week. She had mentioned it sticking. Then I saw my suitcase. It was sitting neatly against the brick wall beside the door. Not tossed, not smashed. Just placed there like something being returned to a store. My shaving kit rested on top. I stared at it for a long time before I knocked. Footsteps inside. A pause. The porch light flickered slightly as the door opened, 2 inches, still chained. It was Jason. 38 years old, 6 feet tall. My wife's son from her first marriage. A man who had been living under my roof for the past 4 months temporarily. His expression wasn't angry. That would have been easier. It was calm. "You shouldn't have come back tonight," he said. I blinked at him. "It's my house." He exhaled like he was dealing with a child. "Mom needs space." I leaned slightly to see past him. Linda stood in the hallway behind him. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't doing anything. "Linda," I called softly. She didn't step forward. Jason's hand tightened on the edge of the door. "We talked about this." "No," I said quietly. "You talked." He smiled then. Not wide, just enough to show teeth. "We changed the locks this afternoon." My eyes drifted to the chain. The deadbolt. The frame I'd installed myself in 1998 after a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. I had painted that door twice, replaced its hinges, sanded the threshold. My suitcase was still beside me. "I live here," I said. Jason tilted his head. "That's debatable." Something in my chest shifted, not sharp, not explosive. Just a slow, heavy drop like an elevator cable snapping quietly inside a shaft. I didn't shout. I didn't pound the door. I didn't demand explanations. I just asked one thing. "Did she agree to this?" Jason didn't answer. He didn't need to. Linda's silence was loud enough. He closed the door. The click of the new lock sounded unfamiliar, foreign. I stood there for another minute, maybe 2. The porch light hummed faintly above me. A moth fluttered against the glass. I picked up my suitcase. The night air was colder than it should have been for early September. I loaded the bag into my car slowly, deliberately. My hands didn't shake. I didn't feel anger, not yet. I felt displacement. I drove around the block twice before parking across the street. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Curtains drawn, television flickering blue behind the living room window. I had bought that house 30 years ago after my first wife passed. Every mortgage payment came from my paycheck. Every improvement, every appliance, every nail in that fence out back, I paid for it. Jason had moved in 4 months ago after his divorce. "Just until I get back on my feet," he'd said. I believed him. I had even given him the spare key myself. That night I reclined the driver's seat and turned off the engine. The quiet was thick. My own breathing sounded too loud. I watched the upstairs bedroom light turn off around midnight. I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the last 3 months in my head, the refinance paperwork he had asked me to co-sign, the awkward tension at dinner, the way Linda had started deferring to him on small decisions. I remembered one sentence clearly. "He's family," she'd told me when I hesitated about co-signing a business loan. "We should support him." I had said no. And now I was sitting in my car, parked outside my own front yard. Around 3 a.m., the temperature dropped enough that I had to pull my jacket from the back seat. The fabric smelled faintly of sawdust from the shed. Familiar. Grounding. I stared at the porch light until dawn. At sunrise, the birds started up in the maple tree beside the driveway. The same tree I planted the year I paid off the mortgage. Paid off. The word echoed strangely. I reached for my phone and opened the banking app. My eyes moved automatically to the mortgage section out of habit. That's when I saw it. A pending refinance inquiry, dated 3 weeks ago. I hadn't applied for one. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. Very slowly. The porch door opened just after 7. Jason stepped outside with a coffee mug in hand. He didn't see me at first. He looked relaxed, confident, like a man who believed the house behind him was already his. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't emotional. This wasn't impulsive. This had been planned. I watched him sip his coffee in the driveway that I had paved. And for the first time that night, I smiled. Not because I was defeated, but because I understood something he didn't. He thought changing the lock changed ownership. He was wrong. I didn't storm back into the house that morning. I didn't call the police. I didn't even step out of my car when Jason finished his coffee and went back inside. Instead, I drove 3 blocks to the diner where Linda and I used to eat every Sunday after church. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee wrapped around me like something familiar and indifferent. Martha, who'd worked there longer than I'd lived in the neighborhood, poured me a cup without asking. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. "I didn't," I replied. I didn't elaborate, because the truth sounded absurd. My wife's son had locked me out of my own home, and my wife had stood behind him and said nothing. I sat in that booth for nearly an hour stirring coffee I didn't drink, replaying conversations in my head. It would have been easier if Jason had been openly hostile from the beginning, if he had stormed in and demanded control, if he had shouted about entitlement. But that wasn't his style. Jason preferred calm, measured, strategic. 4 months earlier, he'd arrived with 2 suitcases and a polite smile. "Just until I get the business off the ground," he'd said. 6 months tops. The business was vague, some kind of property consulting venture. He talked about short-term rentals, digital marketing, investment leverage. Words that sounded expensive but insubstantial. I had asked basic questions. He'd answered most of them, except the financial ones. That's when the cosign request came. He'd placed the paperwork neatly on the kitchen table one evening. "It's just a formality," he said. "The bank wants someone with stronger credit history attached." I read the documents carefully. It wasn't a small business loan. It was a home equity line. On my house. I slid the papers back to him. "No." He had smiled then too. "Not angry. Just patient. You're being overly cautious." "I'm being responsible," I replied. Linda had watched the exchange quietly. Later that night, she told me I was embarrassing him. "He's trying to rebuild his life," she said softly in our bedroom. "You could show a little faith." "I have faith," I answered. "I don't have blindness." She didn't argue further, but something shifted after that. Small things at first. Jason began handling household bills to help out. He offered to streamline our accounts online. Linda praised how organized he was. I noticed my access to certain login portals changed. Passwords updated. He always said it was for efficiency. "You hate dealing with digital stuff anyway?" He'd laugh. I didn't hate it. I simply preferred paper statements. At the diner that morning, I pulled up my banking app again. The refinance inquiry was still there pending documentation review. I tapped deeper. The application listed both my name and Linda's. And under co-owner, Jason's name appeared as authorized representative. I felt something cold settle under my ribs. I hadn't authorized that. I finished my coffee and drove to the bank. The branch manager, a woman named Evelyn I'd known for over 15 years, greeted me warmly. "Good morning, Robert. What can we help you with?" I turned my phone toward her and pointed to the screen. She frowned. "This refinance application, did you initiate this?" "No." Her fingers moved quickly across her keyboard. The clicking felt louder than it should have. "There's a digital signature attached." I didn't sign anything. She glanced up. "You're certain?" "Yes." She hesitated. "Would you be willing to verify your signature here for comparison?" She slid a digital pad across the desk. I signed. She compared it to the uploaded file. Her expression shifted. "It's similar," she said slowly, "but not identical." My chest tightened, not with panic, with confirmation. "Who submitted it?" "It was uploaded through the online portal. From your home IP address." Of course it was. I pictured Jason sitting at the kitchen counter with his laptop, the same place he'd once joked about modernizing our finances. Can you freeze the application? I asked. Evelyn nodded immediately. I'll flag it for investigation. I drove home afterward, but not to the driveway. I parked down the street and walked toward the house. Jason opened the door before I knocked this time. Back already? He asked casually. I spoke to the bank. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. Linda appeared behind him again. We need to talk, she said. I stepped inside only after Jason unhooked the chain. The living room felt unfamiliar. Not because the furniture had changed. Because the atmosphere had. We're concerned about your behavior, Jason began. My behavior. Linda crossed her arms lightly. You've been distant, suspicious. I found a refinance application under my name. Jason exhaled through his nose. That's what this is about. Yes. He shook his head. We discussed refinancing to consolidate debt. No, you discussed it, I declined. Linda stepped forward. Robert, you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you don't remember clearly. I stared at her. Are you suggesting I forgot signing legal documents? Jason's tone softened artificially. No one's accusing you of anything, but sometimes paperwork gets confusing. I looked from him to her, and in that moment I realized something worse than fraud was happening. They were building a narrative. One where I was unstable, forgetful, difficult. The locked door suddenly made more sense. It wasn't just about space. It was about positioning. If they could frame me as erratic, emotional, and capable, then removing me from the house would seem reasonable. I felt anger then, but not explosive anger. Controlled anger. The kind that sharpens focus. I want copies of every document filed under my name in the last 6 months, I said calmly. Jason's eyes flickered. That's unnecessary. It's not a request. Linda looked uneasy now. Robert, why are you escalating this? Because you already did, I thought. But I didn't say it. Instead, I nodded once. Understood. I walked back out the front door voluntarily. Jason didn't stop me. As I reached my car, I glanced back at the house. He stood in the doorway, arms folded. Confident. Certain. He believed the story they were telling. The one where I was overreacting. The one where he was helping. But what he didn't understand yet was that stories collapse when paperwork is examined, and I was about to examine everything. I didn't sleep in my car the second night. I checked into a modest hotel off Route 17, the kind with beige walls, patterned carpet, and a front desk clerk who doesn't ask questions. I paid in cash. Not because I was hiding, but because I didn't want charges showing up on shared accounts. Shared. The word felt different now. I sat at the small desk by the window and spread out everything I had printed from the bank portal. Application forms, disclosure statements, signature confirmations. The digital signature attached to the refinance application looked close enough to mine to pass at a glance. Same looping R, same deliberate underline beneath my last name. But the spacing was wrong. The pressure inconsistent. I've signed my name tens of thousands of times in my life on report cards, mortgage checks, birthday cards, tax returns. Your hand develops memory, rhythm. That wasn't my rhythm. At 8 the next morning, I drove straight to Charles Bennett's office. Charlie had been my attorney for nearly 25 years. We weren't just client and counsel, we'd coached Little League together. He drafted my first will after my daughter was born. When I walked in, he didn't smile. Tell me everything, he said. I did. He listened without interrupting, fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I finished, he leaned back slowly. Let's pull the deed records, he said. I hadn't thought beyond the refinance. That's when things shifted. Charlie's assistant printed out the county property records within minutes. The top page bore my address in bold. And beneath it, a quitclaim deed. Recorded 2 weeks ago. Grantor Robert Hayes, grantee Linda Hayes. Transfer of 50% ownership interest. I stared at it. I never signed that. Charlie didn't react dramatically. He simply nodded once. Then we treated it as fraud. He rotated the document toward me. There it was again, my name, my signature, my supposed consent. The notary stamp was valid. The filing number legitimate. It had been processed properly, which meant someone had walked into a notary office with paperwork bearing my name. Or worse, convinced me to sign something I believed was something else. My mind went back to Jason sitting at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. Just updating insurance beneficiaries, he'd said casually after my birthday dinner. I'd had 2 glasses of wine that night, more than usual. He'd placed a stack of papers in front of me. Initial here, sign there, it's routine. I hadn't read closely, because I trusted my wife. And by extension, her son. I felt something heavier than anger now. Betrayal has layers. The first layer is shock. The second is realization. The third is humiliation. Charlie tapped the page gently. Robert, this quitclaim gives Linda half ownership of the house. I understand what it does. Did you intend that? No. He nodded again. Then we contest it, immediately. He began outlining steps methodically. File an affidavit of fraud. Motion to invalidate the deed. Request forensic signature analysis. Temporary injunction to prevent further transfers. And the refinance, I asked. We freeze it. Charlie paused before continuing. Do you believe Linda knew? The question hit harder than I expected. I replayed her face behind Jason in the doorway. The silence, the folded arms. She knew something, I said quietly. Whether she understood it, I don't know. Charlie exhaled. There's more. He slid another document across the desk. A power of attorney. Limited, financial. Signed by Linda 2 months ago. Granting Jason authority to act on her behalf regarding joint assets. My pulse slowed again. Which means Charlie said evenly, if Linda believes she legally owns half the house and Jason holds financial authority over her interests, he can initiate transactions under her share. So the refinance wasn't about me alone, I said. No, it was about consolidating control. The room felt smaller. Not because of fear, because of precision. This wasn't a tantrum. It wasn't a fight about space. It was a structured takeover. Charlie leaned forward. You said he asked you to co-sign a home equity line. Yes. When you refused, he pivoted. The word landed heavily. Pivoted. I thought of the way Jason spoke, always calm, always reasonable. How he reframed objections as misunderstandings. How he suggested I was overcautious. He hadn't reacted emotionally to my refusal. He'd simply adjusted strategy. Charlie's assistant knocked softly and entered with a tablet. There's something else, she said. Security footage. From the notary office attached to a UPS store 3 towns over. Charlie had contacts everywhere. The grainy video showed a man standing at the counter. Baseball cap, light jacket. Jason. Across from him, Linda. She was holding papers. She looked uncertain. He pointed to a line on the page. She nodded slowly. The timestamp matched the date on the quitclaim deed. I watched my wife sign away half my house under the guidance of her son. I felt something fracture, not loudly but permanently. Does she understand what she signed? Charlie asked. I don't know. He studied my face. You need to prepare for the possibility that she does. Silence settled in the office. Then Charlie's voice hardened slightly. Robert, this isn't about hurt feelings anymore. This is criminal. I nodded. I know. And we move carefully, no confrontation yet. We document everything. I left his office with copies of every filing and a clear plan. Affidavits drafted. Freeze requests initiated. Signature analysis underway. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Jason. We need to settle this like adults. I stared at it for a moment. Then I replied with a single word. Soon. Because he believed I was cornered. He believed I was displaced. He believed that changing a lock and filing paperwork meant ownership. But ownership isn't established by ink alone. It's established by intent. And my intent had never changed. That house was built on 30 years of payments bearing my name. And if he thought a forged signature rewrote that history, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The thing about fraud is that it rarely exists in isolation. Charlie told me that over coffee the next morning as we sat in his office reviewing preliminary findings from the signature analyst. The expert wasn't ready to issue a formal report yet, but his early opinion was clear high probability of guided forgery. Guided. That word stayed with me. It suggested coaching, direction, a hand hovering just out of frame. Jason wasn't impulsive. He was incremental. He moved in small, rational steps that felt harmless until they stacked into something irreversible. Charlie flipped open a manila folder. I made a few calls. He slid several printouts across the desk. Civil complaint, filed 2 years ago. Plaintiff Andrew Morales. Defendant Jason Whitaker. Allegation unauthorized use of electronic signature to secure short-term property loan. Settled out of court. There was no admission of guilt, just repayment and confidentiality. My throat tightened. There's more, Charlie said. Second document, divorce proceedings from Jason's ex-wife. She had alleged financial misrepresentation, joint credit lines opened without full disclosure. Again, no criminal charges, just messy paperwork and a judge urging mediation. He has a pattern, Charlie said evenly. Nothing large enough to trigger felony prosecution, just aggressive enough to exploit gray areas. Gray areas. I remembered how Jason framed everything in neutral tones. It's just temporary. It's just paperwork. It's just restructuring. Always just. Never fully. I drove back toward the house that afternoon, not to confront but to observe. I parked half a block away and walked past casually as if I were just stretching my legs. Through the living room window, I could see Jason seated at the dining table, laptop, open headset on. Linda stood nearby, holding what looked like a folder. She leaned over his shoulder. He didn't look up at her. He gestured toward the screen. I felt an odd detachment watching them, like I was viewing someone else's marriage. This wasn't loud manipulation. It was administrative. The next piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. Charlie's assistant forwarded me a voicemail that had been left at his office, misdirected. A woman's voice. I don't know if you represent him anymore, she said hesitantly, but if Mr. Hayes is involved with Jason Whitaker financially, he needs to be careful. Her name was Rebecca Lawson. She had dated Jason briefly the year before he moved into our home. I met her 2 days later at a small cafe downtown. She looked nervous but resolved. I'm not trying to cause trouble, she began, but I recognized his name when a mutual friend mentioned he'd moved in with you. Why are you concerned? I asked gently. She exhaled slowly. He convinced me to co-sign a short-term lease agreement for an investment property. He said it was low risk, routine. I felt my jaw tighten. Then what? He transferred the lease into a holding company under his control. When payments fell behind, I was legally attached. Did you pursue charges? She shook her head. I couldn't afford litigation. How much? $26,000. The number echoed strangely, not astronomical, but significant. It wasn't the money, she added quietly. It was how calm he was while explaining why it wasn't really his fault. That calm again. The rational tone. Steady eyes. Rebecca leaned forward. He doesn't explode. He reframes. He makes you question your own memory. I thought of Linda suggesting I might not remember signing documents clearly. I thought of Jason's text, let's settle this like adults. He wasn't escalating. He was positioning. When I returned to the hotel that night, my phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Linda. Robert, I don't understand why you're dragging attorneys into this. Jason is just trying to protect our future. Protect. I replayed the words several times. Protect from what? From me. The following morning, Charlie called. We subpoenaed metadata on the refinance application, he said. The upload originated from your home network, but the digital signature file was created from a different device. Whose? Jason's laptop. He paused. There's something else. He attempted to access your retirement account portal 3 weeks ago. I felt a slow heat rise behind my eyes. That account isn't connected to the house. No, Charlie replied, but it's liquid. Pattern. It wasn't just about property. It was about control. I sat in silence for a long moment. Then Charlie asked quietly, are you ready to confront him? Not yet. Why? Because he believes I'm confused. Charlie didn't respond immediately. And confusion makes people underestimate you. I returned to the neighborhood that afternoon, not to enter the house, but to retrieve something from the mailbox. Jason opened the door before I reached it. You're avoiding conversation, he said evenly. I'm documenting conversation, I replied. His lips curved faintly. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. Am I? He stepped onto the porch. You've always been cautious. That's fine. But at some point, you have to trust family. Trust. The word felt almost ironic now. I trusted you, I said. His eyes flickered just for a second. Then why are we here, he asked. Because you mistook restraint for weakness. Because you thought slow meant unaware. Because you believed paperwork rewritten in silence would go unchallenged. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I looked past him into the hallway where Linda stood again watching. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to fully admit. This wasn't just Jason's pattern. It was Linda's decision. She had signed. She had stood silent. She had allowed the narrative to shift. Jason believed he was executing strategy. But control doesn't thrive without permission. And if there was one thing I understood now, it was that this wasn't about a lock. It wasn't about space. It was about ownership of reality. And I was done letting them define it. I didn't return to the house with anger. I returned with timing. Charlie finalized the filings within 48 hours. The affidavit of fraud, the motion to invalidate the quitclaim deed, the request for forensic signature review, a petition for temporary restraining order against any property transfer or encumbrance. There was also something else, a notice of criminal complaint for suspected forgery, and a freeze order request submitted to both the mortgage lender and the county recorder's office. Every page carried weight. Not emotional weight, legal weight. Charlie handed me the sealed envelope personally. Once he opens this, he said evenly, the balance shifts. I nodded. That's the idea. The morning I went back, the air was clear, cool, crisp enough to feel deliberate. I parked in the driveway this time. Not across the street. Not down the block. The driveway. My shoes crunched lightly against the gravel near the garage door. I paused for a moment, not to gather courage, but to steady rhythm. Jason opened the door before I knocked. He must have seen my car. He leaned casually against the frame. You finally ready to talk? I held up the envelope. I'm ready. His eyes dropped to it, thick, official, sealed. He smiled. There it was again, that restrained, confident curve of his mouth. I'm glad, he said. This back and forth is exhausting. Linda appeared behind him, tension visible in her shoulders. What's in the envelope, she asked. Clarity, I replied. Jason extended his hand and I placed it there. He turned it over, inspecting the law firm's embossed return address. Wow, he said lightly, you really went all in. He broke the seal slowly, deliberately, like a man savoring victory. For a split second, I could almost see the version of events he had constructed in his mind. He believed I had conceded. Perhaps signed something. Perhaps agreed to leave quietly. He believed the envelope contained surrender. He unfolded the first document. The motion to invalidate deed. His smile faltered just slightly. He continued reading. Affidavit of fraud. Forensic signature analysis request. His jaw tightened. Linda stepped closer. What is it, she asked. He flipped to the next page. Temporary restraining order. Freeze on property transfer. Notice of criminal complaint filed with the county prosecutor's office. The color drained from his face in stages. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. But undeniable. The confident posture dissolved first, then the steady breathing, then the composure. You filed charges, he asked quietly. I filed documentation, I said. You're accusing me of a crime. I'm requesting investigation. Linda grabbed the papers from his hand and scanned them. Her breathing quickened. Robert, she said, this is extreme. No, I replied calmly. Forgery is extreme. Jason's voice sharpened. You signed those papers. I signed insurance updates, I said evenly. Not ownership transfers. You're twisting this. I'm correcting it. He stepped off the porch, now closer to me. You're blowing up this family over paperwork. I met his eyes. You tried to take my house. He scoffed, but it lacked conviction. It's half mom's. That's what you thought. He hesitated. What does that mean? I didn't answer immediately. Because timing matters. Instead, I said quietly, page 4. He flipped to it. Attached to the filing was a copy of the original trust document I had created 10 years earlier, long before I married Linda. Irrevocable living trust. Property transferred into trust under my sole authority. Linda granted lifetime occupancy rights in the event of my death. Ownership beneficiary, my daughter Emily. Not Jason. Not Linda. Not anyone else. The quitclaim deed they filed had attempted to transfer property that was no longer solely mine to give, which meant the deed was not only forged, it was legally void. Jason stared at the page for a long moment. That trust doesn't matter, he said finally, though his voice had lost its steadiness. It matters very much, I replied. Linda looked from him to me. You put the house in a trust, she asked. Yes. When Masotwasyo 10 years ago. Why didn't you tell me? Because it predates you. Silence expanded between us. Jason's eyes moved rapidly across the documents again. You're bluffing, he said weakly. Charlie Bennett doesn't bluff. As if summoned by cue, a black sedan turned onto the street and pulled slowly to the curb. Two uniformed officers stepped out. Not aggressive, not rushed, professional. Jason's composure finally fractured. You called the police, he snapped. I filed a complaint. They're following procedure. One officer approached calmly. Mr. Whitaker, he asked. Jason swallowed. Yes, now Wavy. We'd like to speak with you regarding a reported forgery. Linda gasped softly. This is unnecessary, Jason insisted. This is a misunderstanding. The officer remained steady. Sir, please step aside. Jason looked at me, anger now visible raw. You're destroying everything, he hissed. No, I said quietly. You did that when you changed the locks. The officer guided him toward the sidewalk. Not handcuffed. Not yet, but questioned. Neighbors' curtains shifted subtly. Linda stood frozen on the porch, clutching the documents. Her eyes were wide, not just with fear, with realization. You knew, she whispered. Jason didn't answer. He didn't need to. The narrative had collapsed. The calm tone, the reframing, the positioning. It all dissolved under paper and procedure. I didn't smile. There was nothing triumphant about it. Just necessary. The officer turned back toward me. Mr. Hayes will follow up once we review the documentation. I nodded. Thank you. As the patrol car door closed behind Jason, I felt something settle. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Resolution. Because he had believed the envelope contained my surrender. Instead, it contained truth. And truth, once opened, doesn't go pale. It exposes. Jason wasn't arrested that morning. Not immediately. The officers questioned him in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes while Linda stood on the porch clutching the documents like they might dissolve in her hands. I stayed where I was near the edge of the walkway, close enough to hear fragments of conversation, far enough not to interfere. I didn't forge anything, Jason insisted. He signed voluntarily. Sir, one officer replied calmly, that's for the investigation to determine. His tone was professional, not accusatory, but the weight of it landed just the same. Jason kept glancing toward me, searching for something, sympathy, hesitation, weakness. He didn't find it. When the officers finally left, they instructed him not to leave the county until contacted by the district attorney's office. He nodded stiffly. The patrol car rolled away. Silence followed. Jason turned toward me, face flushed now, not pale like when he'd opened the envelope, but red with something closer to fury. You could have handled this privately, he said through clenched teeth. I tried, I answered. No, you escalated. I documented. Linda finally spoke. Jason, did you know about the trust? He hesitated just a fraction too long. I thought it was outdated, he said. That's not what I asked. Her voice trembled. He exhaled sharply. Mom, don't do this. But she was already doing it. She stepped off the porch and faced him fully. Did you know the house wasn't legally his to transfer? Jason's jaw flexed. I believed, Monsieur Newon. Did you know, she repeated. He didn't answer. And in that silence, something inside her shifted. The facade of strategic calm he'd maintained for months began cracking at the edges. His shoulders tightened. His breathing quickened. The confident posture he wore like a tailored suit no longer fit. You don't understand how hard it is to rebuild after divorce, he snapped suddenly. You don't know what it's like to start over. I do, I said quietly. I buried a wife and raised a daughter alone. His eyes flashed. That's different. No, I replied evenly. It isn't. Linda stepped back slightly as if the ground had tilted beneath her. You told me he agreed, she whispered to Jason. You said he wanted to restructure things. He did, Jason insisted. He just changed his mind. I held up a copy of the forensic analyst's preliminary report. Signature pressure inconsistent. Stroke hesitation indicative of guided execution, I read aloud. Jason laughed, but it sounded hollow. Technical nonsense. Linda took the page from my hand. She studied it slowly. Guided, she murmured. Jason ran a hand through his hair, pacing now. You're both overreacting. This is just legal maneuvering. No, Linda said softly, almost to herself. This is control. That word again. Control. It hung in the air between them like a verdict. Jason stopped pacing. "You're choosing him over me," he demanded. "I'm choosing the truth," she replied. For the first time since this began, I saw fear in his eyes, not of prison, not of fines, of exposure. Charlie called that afternoon. "The district attorney's office is reviewing the complaint," he said. "The metadata on the digital signature file confirms it originated from Jason's laptop. That strengthens the case." "And Linda?" I asked quietly. "Has she retained counsel?" "Not yet. She might." I hung up and walked back toward the house. The front door stood open. Linda sat at the dining table, the same place Jason had once laid out refinance documents for me to sign. The laptop was closed now. The house felt different, not reclaimed yet, but unsettled. "I didn't know," she said as I entered. I didn't answer immediately. Didn't know what I asked. That it was structured like this. The trust, the legalities. I explained the trust when we married. "You said you'd taken care of estate planning." "Yes." I didn't realize that meant the house wasn't partially mine. "It would have been if I died." She looked up sharply. "So I only mattered in absence." "That's not what I said. But that's how it feels." The honesty in her voice surprised me. "This isn't about inheritance," I said carefully. "It's about process, consent." She swallowed hard. "He told me you were becoming paranoid, that you were slipping." The words landed heavier than the forged signature. "He said your memory was fading." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course he had. Control doesn't just shift paperwork. It rewrites perception. "I'm not slipping," I said calmly. She nodded slowly, tears forming. "I see that now." From outside, I heard Jason's car engine start abruptly. Linda stood. "He's leaving." "He's not supposed to," I said quietly. She stepped onto the porch as his sedan pulled out of the driveway too fast. For the first time, he didn't look composed. He looked cornered. That evening, the district attorney's office called. Formal charges would likely follow pending full forensic confirmation. I hung up and walked through the house slowly. The walls were the same shade of cream I had painted years ago. The floors creaked in familiar patterns. The maple tree outside cast long shadows across the living room. It felt like my house again. Not because of locks, not because of police presence, but because the narrative had collapsed. Jason's version of events where I was unstable, irrational, forgetful, couldn't withstand documentation. And Linda saw it now. She stood in the hallway uncertain. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said. "I know. Can we fix it?" I considered that carefully. "Trust isn't paperwork," I said quietly. "It's pattern." She nodded, tears sliding freely now. Outside, the porch light flickered on automatically as dust settled. For months, Jason had operated under the assumption that calm manipulation was strength. But calm integrity, that's something different. And as night fell over the house I had nearly lost, I realized something else. Control collapses when confronted. But rebuilding, that's slower, harder, and not guaranteed. The district attorney filed formal charges 3 weeks later. Forgery, attempted real estate fraud, identity misuse. Not dramatic headlines, not flashing lights. Just paperwork again. Jason didn't fight the charges the way I expected. He hired a public defender and tried to negotiate a plea. The forensic report came back conclusive. The digital signature file had been created on his laptop, edited twice before submission, and uploaded through my home network. There was no ambiguity left to argue. He accepted a plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for restitution and probation contingent on repayment of legal fees and compliance monitoring. No jail time, but a criminal record. It wasn't cinematic justice. It was procedural. And sometimes that's stronger. Linda attended the hearing with me. She didn't sit beside Jason. She sat 2 rows behind him, hands folded tightly in her lap. When the judge read the findings, Jason stared straight ahead, jaw rigid. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at his mother. For the first time since he moved into my home, he looked smaller. Not physically, strategically. After the hearing, he approached us outside the courthouse. "This didn't have to go this far," he muttered. "It did," I replied calmly. Linda's voice trembled. "You told me he agreed." Jason shook his head. "I thought he would." "That's not consent," she said. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and something hardened behind his eyes. "You're choosing him," he said quietly. "No," she answered. "I'm choosing accountability." He didn't respond. He walked down the courthouse steps alone. And just like that, the man who believed he could reposition ownership through confidence and paperwork was reduced to probation terms and monthly check-ins. But legal closure doesn't automatically restore emotional structure. The house felt quiet after that. Linda moved into the guest room for a while, not because I asked her to, but because distance felt necessary. We spoke carefully at first, measured conversations, honest ones. I let him manage too much, she admitted one evening as we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. You trusted him, I said. I trusted him over you. The distinction mattered. You believed I was slipping, I said gently. I let him convince me. That was the fracture that cut deepest, not the forged deed, not the refinance attempt. The narrative. He had tried to paint me as unstable. And for a moment she believed it. I won't pretend this didn't change things, I said. I know, she replied. Silence settled between us, not hostile, just real. 2 weeks later, I replaced the locks again. Not to exclude, to reset. I walked through each room afterward, touching walls lightly, as if reacquainting myself with a familiar landscape that had briefly shifted underfoot. The trust documents were updated to reflect the court findings. My daughter Emily called that evening. I heard about everything, she said gently. Are you okay? I am. You always think 3 steps ahead, she added. I smiled slightly. Not always, but enough. That house had been in a trust long before Linda entered my life. I didn't create it out of distrust, I created it out of foresight. After my first wife passed, I learned something about permanence. Ownership isn't just about possession. It's about intention. Linda and I began counseling 3 months later. Not because a court required it, because we did. Rebuilding trust takes more than apology. It takes transparency, access to accounts, shared visibility, and uncomfortable conversations. Jason moved into an apartment across town under the terms of his probation. We didn't see him often, but the few times we did at mandated restitution meetings, his tone had changed. Less confident, less strategic, more careful. Control collapses quietly. The maple tree in the yard turned gold that fall. I sat on the porch one evening, watching leaves scatter across the driveway I once thought I might lose. Linda joined me holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to me and sat down. Why didn't you fight harder that first night, she asked softly. When he locked you out. I thought about that. Because shouting doesn't fix paperwork, I said. And I needed to see how far he'd go. She nodded slowly. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know. The porch light flickered on as dusk settled, the same warm glow I had stared at from my car that first night. Only now I wasn't outside looking in. I was home. But home isn't walls. It's clarity. It's knowing whose name is on the deed, not just legally, but morally. Jason believed ownership could be repositioned through confidence and convenience. He mistook silence for weakness. He mistook patience for surrender. But patience, when paired with documentation, becomes something else entirely. It becomes strength. If you've ever felt displaced in your own life, whether by family circumstance or manipulation, I want you to remember something. Calm doesn't mean defeated. Silence doesn't mean unaware. And paperwork doesn't override truth. I'd like to know, have you ever had to stand quietly while someone tried to rewrite your reality? Tell me in the comments below, and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single message. We share stories like this every day, stories about integrity, resilience, and protecting what matters most. If this resonated with you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking this journey together.